Okay, hello. So for this presentation, we're going to be looking now at inductive logic, switching away finally from deductive logic, which most of the book is concerned with deductive logic. And so we haven't seen induction since really chapter 1. I haven't talked about it much at all since then. So let's just do a quick review of some of the main differences between deduction and induction. So remember, in deductive logic, a deductively logical argument is one in which the premises support the conclusion 100%, right? If the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. You know, it's a deductively valid argument. By contrast, an inductive argument is one in which the premises are intended to support the conclusion, hopefully, but they do so somewhat less than 100%. Now, it could be very close to 100%. You know, the premises could support the conclusion 99% or something like that. But as long as it's not 100%, then it's induction. If it really does work out that the premises provide 100% guaranteed support for the conclusion, well, then it's a deductive argument. It just can't be an inductive argument if it's set up so that the premises support the conclusion at 100%. So here's another way of saying that, is that an inductive argument can never be deductively valid. It just doesn't make sense. If it's a valid argument, well, then it's a deductive argument, right? That's just what it means to be deductively valid. And also, while in deductive logic, we measure the quality of an argument in terms of deductive validity and deductive soundness. Remember, to be deductively valid, again, I've repeated this many times, but that's okay. So a deductively valid argument is one in which if the premises are true, then the conclusion is guaranteed to be true. And then a deductively sound argument is one that is first deductively valid, but then also all the premises actually are true. And that's the highest standard, the highest possible standard for an argument. You can pretty much trust that conclusion is absolutely true. But in inductive arguments, instead of validity and soundness, we measure the quality of the argument in terms of strength and cogency. So remember that a strong argument is one in which the premises support the conclusion. They make it more likely that the conclusion is true than you would otherwise think, right? So before you hear about the premises, you might think like, well, it's 50-50 chance that the conclusion is true. But then once you hear the premises, it's like, now it's increased my confidence that this conclusion is more likely than not to be true. Now, it might have only raised your confidence a little bit, right? It went from just bare 50% to 51% likely to be true. If so, that's still a strong argument, right? It still increased the probability that the conclusion is true. But then on the other hand, a weak argument is one that it could have just no effect on the probability of the conclusion being true at all, right? So before you hear the premises, you're like 50-50 whether the conclusion is true or not, and then you hear the premises and you're still at 50-50, right? Maybe the premises just had no effect on whether the conclusion is more or less likely to be true. So that would be a weak argument. But even more commonly, is a weak argument is when the premises actually decrease the probability of the conclusion being true, right? So again, you go into this saying like, well, it's 50-50 as to whether the conclusion is true or not. Then you hear the premises and you're like, oh, actually now it's less than 50% likely that the conclusion is true. So if that's the situation, then you're dealing with a weak argument. Another thing that might be worth noticing is that strength and weakness, they both come in degrees, right? So an argument can be more or less strong, right? You have two strong arguments, but one's stronger than the other. Or two weak arguments, but one is weaker than the other. And this is another big difference between inductive arguments and deductive arguments, right? So a deductive argument, it's either valid or it's not. You know, it's either sound or it's not. There's no degrees of validity or soundness. Unlike in inductive arguments, there are degrees of strength and degrees of weakness. Okay, so here's some examples that I actually had in chapter 1 as well, but they're worth revisiting here. So here's a very simple example of a strong argument. Right, so most Canadians speak French. Bob is a Canadian, so therefore Bob speaks French. And so let's assume that before this, you had no information about Bob. You have no idea who he is, where he's from, what language he speaks, or anything. So you're sort of neutral as to whether Bob speaks French or not. Then you see these premises. It's like, oh, okay, well now that's increased my confidence. It's increased the probability from my perspective that Bob is a French speaker. Obviously, this is not guaranteed. It could still be that Bob doesn't speak French, even though he's a Canadian, and even though most Canadians speak French. But at least we now have increased confidence in the possibility that Bob does in fact speak French. So it's deductively invalid, but it's inductively strong. Here's a weak argument. So a small percentage of Canadians speak Greek. Honestly, I don't know what percentage of Canadians speak Greek, but it's a small percentage, it's less than 50%. Then Bob is Canadian, so therefore Bob speaks Greek. Like, well, clearly this is a weak argument, right? If we were sort of neutral as to whether, before we knew about his nationality or his language skills or anything, Bob was a completely generic individual, we would be sort of neutral as to whether he speaks Greek or not. But then we learn this about him, right, that he's Canadian, and we also learn that only a small percentage of Canadians speak Greek. Well, then how confident are we that Bob himself speaks Greek? Not very, right? We think it's kind of unlikely that he does. So this is a weak argument. Then a weak argument, as I mentioned before, can be cogent. So a cogent argument is one that's first inductively strong, but then all the premises are actually true. And in fact, what we had up here was a cogent argument, right? That most Canadians speak French. Like, yeah, there's a lot of Canadians that speak French, right? It's sort of one of the official languages of Canada. So that's a cogent argument in addition to being a strong argument. However, an uncogent argument is one that starts out strong, but at least one premise is false. So here would be an example of that, right? So so this is one where it's true. I already showed you this one, right? Bob is a Canadian, so Bob speaks French. But then let's look at this one. So most Coloradans speak French. Bob is a Coloradan, so Bob speaks French. Well, do most people speak French in Colorado? Like, no. I don't know exactly what the percentage is, but I don't even really know very many people in Colorado that speak French. So it's relatively rare. So although on its own, this is a strong argument, if it were true that most Coloradans speak French and that Bob is a Coloradan, then it would give us extra confidence that Bob indeed does speak French. So it's a strong argument. It just is that the first premise is actually false. And so while it's strong, it fails to be cogent. So it's uncogent. Okay, so next we're going to look at a few different argument forms. We saw argument forms when we were dealing with deductive logic. And so here are a few with inductive logic. So here's a real common one. The examples I've been giving so far are of this form. They are, as they call it, statistical syllogisms. And so here's kind of a generic form. N%, N is a number, right? Greater than 0, but less than 100. But N% of A's are B. And then some individual, we'll just call him C, some individual C is an A. So therefore, that individual C is a B. And so this is sort of a variation on the very first example we ever saw at the very beginning of chapter 1 that said that all humans are mortal. Socrates is a human, so therefore Socrates is mortal. But this is, that was a deductive argument. In fact, it's a deductively valid argument, whereas this is an inductive argument. But notice what happens if N, the number, the percentage here, is either 0 or 100. If N is 100, then it turns this into a deductively valid argument. It becomes like that Socrates is mortal kind of argument, right? If we said 100% of humans are mortal, that's basically the same thing as saying all humans are mortal. And then Socrates is a human, so therefore Socrates is mortal, right? So if N is 100, then this is a deductively valid argument, and it's not an inductive argument at all anymore. But if n is 0, 0% of A's are B, well, then it wouldn't take much modification to turn this into a deductively valid argument, right? So all we'd have to do is put a not into the conclusion, right? 0% of A's are B. That's the same as saying all A's are not B, right? Or no A's are B. And then C is an A, so therefore C is not B. Okay, so if n, the percentage here, goes all the way to 0 or all the way to 100, then we're dealing with a deductive argument and not an inductive argument anymore. So just kind of the take-home message is that the n, the percentage here, has to be somewhere between 0 and 100, and it can't be equal to 0 and it can't be equal to 100. Okay, and then when we have just kind of a standard version here, where the conclusion is asserting that C is a B, then if n, the percentage, is less than or equal to 50, then it's a weak argument. But if it's greater than 50, then it's a strong argument. And this is worth noting too, you know, it depends on the phrasing we've got here. So instead of citing an actual number for n percentage, we could use some English term that implies the same sort of thing. You know, it's more vague as to exactly what percentage we're referring to here. But few, if we say instead of many, instead of some percentage like 30% of A's are B, instead we say few of them are B, few A's are B, or not very many A's are B, or almost no A's are B, and then try to conclude from that, you know, given that C is an A, conclude that C is also a B. Well, that's a weak argument, right? If not very many A's are B and C is an A, then it's not very likely that C is also a B. But on the other hand, if we say most or almost all, right? So almost all A's are B, or most A's are B, and then C is an A, then we can conclude with some confidence, at least some increased confidence, that C is a B as well. The evaluation switches though if the conclusion is a negative, right? So C is not a B. Well, what would support that conclusion? If not very many A's are B, right? So if we have few A's or B, not very many A's or B's, almost no A's or B's, and then C is a B, I'm sorry, C is an A, and then we conclude that C is not a B, well, then that becomes a strong argument. Okay, and so moving on. There are a few other argument forms to get to, but before we get to any of those, just a quick caution about how statistical syllogisms are sometimes used here. So you could have a statistical syllogism that is strong and even cogent. That is, the premises really do increase the probability of the conclusion being true, and all the premises are true. So that's a cogent argument, but it still might be kind of misleading in some important way. And the problem that I'm sort of referencing here in the book, they call it the fallacy of the incomplete evidence, right? So it looks on the surface of it like a really good inductive argument, a cogent inductive argument, but there's a problem, right? So this is a modified version of one they have in the book. So let's say we start off like this: 13% of US citizens have an advanced college degree, and I even looked that up. And so it's true that 13% of US citizens have an advanced college degree. And by advanced college degree, we mean something above a bachelor's degree, so a master's degree or a doctoral degree like a PhD or MD or a law degree. Okay, so 13% of US citizens have an advanced college degree. Bob is a US citizen, so therefore Bob does not have an advanced college degree. This is a strong argument. In fact, it's a cogent argument, assuming for now, just take my word for it, that Bob is a US citizen. And like I said, I looked up the statistic here. So this seems like a cogent argument that we can conclude with pretty good confidence here that it's true that Bob does not have an advanced college degree. Of course, it doesn't guarantee it. You know, Bob could be one of the exceptions among the general US population, but given these premises, we should have pretty good confidence that Bob does not have a college degree, an advanced college degree. However, it could be that this argument is intentionally or unintentionally leaving out some really important information about Bob, right? So what if it turns out that Bob is actually a college professor? Well, and it turns out that almost all college professors have an advanced degree. That's pretty much a requirement for getting hired as a college professor. Now, there are extremely rare circumstances where somebody has achieved really amazing things in their field of study, but they just don't happen to have an advanced degree in that field, and nevertheless, they get hired on at a university as a professor. And so, it's not 100% of college professors have an advanced college degree, but, it's a good 99% of them do. And so if Bob, it turns out, is a college professor in the United States, then it's still true that he's a US citizen, and it's still true that only 13% of US citizens have an advanced college degree. So that previous argument was still, its premises were still true, but the argument was misleading. And this is a more sort of faithful argument, right? So 99% of US professors have an advanced college degree. Bob is a US professor, so therefore Bob has an advanced college degree. So both arguments have true premises, but obviously they have opposite conclusions. So which is more reliable? Right? It seems as though the previous argument was committing this fallacy of incomplete evidence. And so this one is the more reliable one, because the statistic that's being cited here is more directly relevant to whether Bob has a college degree, an advanced college degree or not. Okay, moving on to the next argument form in inductive arguments. So argument from authority. And in chapter 4, when we were talking about informal fallacies, we saw how this kind of an argument can go wrong. And so we'll mention a few of those things that we talked about back there as well. But just the argument form itself is really simple. R, we'll say that capital R here represents somebody that could potentially be an authority on this topic. And they are sincerely asserting, right? They're not trying to mislead, they're not trying to lie or anything. So they are sincerely asserting some fact, and we'll just call that fact S. So they're sincerely asserting that S is true. And so this is their report. And in fact, this argument from authority is sometimes even just called a report. So when this person sincerely asserts that, then we conclude that S must be true. Or it's, we might say S is likely to be true. Our confidence in S has gone up after hearing this report from the authority. So how do we go about assessing the strength and cogency of this relatively simple argument form when it's presented to us with actual content? Well, there's a few things that we need to think about when assessing how strong this argument is. So obviously, is the source reliable, right? Is this a relevantly reliable authority on the topic that S is, whatever S is about? So we might look at their past performance, right? Has R made pronouncements about similar things in the past? And if R, whoever this authority is, was accurate, right? They got it right in the past, then that increases our confidence that this is a good authority to be paying attention to now. Doesn't guarantee it, right? Just because somebody was successful in their predictions or their opinions in the past, that doesn't automatically mean that they're forever going to be correct. They could get it wrong sometimes. So that's why it's not a deductively valid argument, right? We're not guaranteeing that the conclusion is true. We're just increased our confidence that the conclusion is true. We might also look at, do they have the relevant kind of education in the field that they're talking about, or any kind of specific training or experience in that field that might give us extra reasons for believing that R is a reliable reporter of whether S is true or not. Then we might also look at any obvious biases that they have in this particular case. So for example, it could be that the authority, we're talking about whether somebody is lying. And so this person is an authority, right? Maybe they're a psychologist and they're an authority on detecting whether somebody is lying or not. And so they're really good at figuring this out, at predicting whether somebody is lying. And so we should rely on their authority as to whether this individual that we're facing now is in fact lying. But it could be that this individual that we're wondering about right now is a family member of the authority, right? A family member of the expert. And they don't want to think of their family member as a liar, and so they're already predisposed to sort of believe their family member, and they might sort of, without even really trying to, they might overlook some of the key things that show that this person is really lying. And so in this sort of a case where the authority is talking about one of their family members, we might worry that they're sort of biased in this particular case. So that might decrease our confidence in the quality of this particular authority in this particular situation. Okay, some other things to be thinking about when assessing whether an argument from authority is a strong argument or not. Are there other people giving us their opinion or their beliefs about this topic, about whether S is true or not? Well, then we need to start comparing the reliability. We need to go back to this and do this, right? Evaluate past performance and relevant education, training, and experience, and so on, for everybody, all of the supposed authorities that are speaking on this topic, and then try as best we can to figure out who are the most reliable authorities. But just the fact that other authorities do disagree, especially if they do have sort of good qualities here, the fact that different authorities disagree on a topic, that in and of itself should maybe decrease our confidence in the truth of the statement, the truth of S that was being asserted here in the argument. If we see some disagreement, especially if it's honest debate that's going on in this field of study, and different experts disagree about what to believe here, then just because one expert, even if they're a really good, reliable authority, if an equally reliable authority disagrees, then that should decrease our confidence that S is true. Then is the authority accurately quoted or represented, right? So it might not be the authority themselves that's presenting this argument to us. It could be that somebody else is telling us about what an authority says. And so they could be falsely representing what that authority says, or sort of giving us incomplete information. This would actually bring us back to something like that fallacy of incomplete information that we saw with the statistical syllogisms, right? So they might be presenting something to us that is true, this is something true that the authority said, but when we put what the authority said in the larger context of the authority's work, it's not actually telling us what this person is claiming that the authority is telling us. That sounds a little complicated, so here's actually an example, and this is a real example that I experienced, I saw happen in real time back in, I think this was like 2004 or so, 2004, 2005. Carol Cleland is a philosophy professor, and she's a professor here at CU Boulder, and her area of expertise is philosophy of science. In fact, she was my dissertation advisor. That's my main area of expertise too, is philosophy of science. So she's done some work on evaluating the quality of historical science fields. These are fields of science like paleontology and geology, things that look into the past and try to figure out what's happened in the past. One of these historical fields of research is evolutionary biology. At least one important part of evolutionary biology is concerned with looking at how has evolution played out in the past, right? So we've got species that are around now, they maybe have some interesting characteristics. What's the history of this species lineage? How did they come to evolve this interesting characteristic, right? So it's kind of a backward looking, it's a historical looking field of science. And so there were court battles back in the early 2000s over whether evolutionary theory should be taught exclusively as sort of the theory of biology in public school science classrooms. There were people who thought first maybe that evolutionary theory shouldn't be taught at all. And then there were also people who thought that if we do teach evolutionary theory, we should also teach something like creationism or intelligent design theory, if you've heard of that. These are sort of, well, the scientific community considers these to be non-scientific rivals to evolutionary theory. So they present this argument that they heard from Carol Cleland. Carol Cleland argues that historical science is not 100% reliable. Evolutionary theory relies on historical science, therefore evolutionary theory is not reliable. Well, all of these premises are true. She indeed has argued that historical science is not 100% reliable. And it indeed is true that evolutionary theory relies on historical science. So it seems like this is a really good argument based on reporting from an authority. However, here's sort of the more realistic information, the important information that this argument is leaving out. And Carol Cleland was extremely upset when she saw that opponents of evolutionary theory, evolution deniers basically, were presenting her work as being sort of in favor of their viewpoint, because she argues that no science is 100% reliable. Even physics and chemistry and these sort of paradigmatic experimental sciences, they're not 100% reliable either. No science is 100% reliable. And in fact, she even argues that historical science is no less reliable than any other field of science. And so, although the premises of this argument are true, they're sort of misrepresenting what this particular authority really has to say about the quality of evolutionary theory. Okay, moving on to another argument form then. Argument from analogy. So this one, it has this basic form, right? So A, whatever A is, or A's are similar to B's, right? A is similar to B. B has property P, so therefore A has property P. Now this doesn't guarantee, this is not intended to be a deductively valid argument, right? So we're not trying to guarantee that the conclusion is true. We're just trying to make it more likely, right? We're trying to increase our confidence that this conclusion is true. But of course, in order for this kind of an argument to work, it needs to be a good analogy, right? It needs to be an analogy such that A and B are relevantly similar. So here's some things to pay attention to. Is the similarity between A and B relevant to whether something would even have property P at all? And we'd have to look at the specific example here. So here's one. These two kinds of birds, right? Tanagers and penguins are analogous, right? Tanagers and penguins both have feathers. Penguins live in Antarctica, so therefore tanagers live in Antarctica. Right? Okay, so the premises are true, but is this a good analogy? Is having feathers relevant to whether you can live or do live in Antarctica? Maybe you are familiar with what tanagers are like. Well, here's a picture. So tanagers, they are not Arctic birds. They're certainly not Antarctic birds, just sort of regular birds. This picture is actually a Western tanager. They're really these beautiful, striking birds that are can be seen in Colorado around springtime and early summer. They do not live in Antarctica. They can't live in Antarctica. They will freeze to death very quickly. And so just having feathers, that's not really relevant to being able to live in Antarctica. So that's a problem here. Now, contrast that with this argument. Seals and penguins, drawing an analogy between them. Seals and penguins both have excellent insulation. Okay, now having excellent insulation clearly is relevant to whether something can or does live in Antarctica. And so seals and penguins both have excellent insulation. Penguins live in Antarctica, so therefore seals live in Antarctica. Okay, doesn't guarantee that seals live in Antarctica, but it does increase the probability. If somehow you didn't know whether seals live, that any kind of seals are able to live or do live in Antarctica, then this would increase the probability for you that it's true that there are seals in Antarctica. Okay. The other thing to think about with arguments from analogy is this. Are the two things that we're saying are analogous, are they dissimilar in some way that would be relevant to them having property P? And of course, that is the case with the tanager example. They both have feathers, but there's another way that they are dissimilar. Penguins and tanagers are dissimilar in a more important way. The tanager's lack of insulation, right? So the amount of insulation that these two kinds of birds have, that's the more relevant dissimilarity between these two things. And so that makes it clear that this is a weak argument. One more thing to mention here. So are the other things besides the thing that we're using, besides A? Are there other things that are similar to B in the same sort of way, but those other things that are similar to B lack property P? And that, of course, is also the case in our tanager example. So tanagers and penguins are analogous because they both have feathers, but there's other things that are analogous in the same way, other things that also have feathers, but they do not have property P. You know, so imagine like you didn't know what tanagers were, and so you just weren't sure, like, is this person trying to fool me or not by giving me this argument? Well, what are all the other things that you know of that have feathers, you know, that are relevant to penguins in the same way? Do those things live in the Arctic or the Antarctic? No, right? Almost all other birds fail to have that property of living in Antarctica. So this is another way of showing that this is a really weak argument, right? It's a bad analogy. Okay, so here's another example of an argument from analogy, and it's one in which an argument from analogy is used in the philosophical literature. It's really common in applied ethics. That is where we're taking some ethical theory of some kind and we're applying it to a particular situation, right? We're trying to figure out what's the right thing to do in this given circumstance. And so a common technique is to use argument from analogy there. And it's really common when we've got this kind of a situation in applied ethics, where we've got a moral issue that for one reason or another is just too difficult to address directly. You know, the author wants to present their argument in favor of what we should do in this situation, but it could be that the situation is really complicated. So it's just really difficult for us to sort through all the issues and come to a good conclusion here as to what the right thing to do is. Or it could be that we just have too many preconceptions, right? It could be a moral situation that we've heard about, and there's so much baggage associated with it, we could call it that. You know, just so many kind of irrelevant considerations that are swirling around this issue that makes it really difficult to zero in on what's the key features of this moral situation that should really drive our decision as to what the morally correct thing to do is. Or it could be a moral situation that really engages our emotions in a very strong way. So we get really upset or really angry or really stressed out or really happy, you know, really joyful. Somehow or another, this moral situation engages our emotions in a strong way. And as we know, when our emotions are really heightened, it makes it much more difficult to like calmly and rationally sort through the relevant facts to come to the best conclusion possible. So what philosophers often do when they're faced with this situation is they construct an analogous situation, it might be kind of a fake situation, that is a lot easier to come to a conclusion about what the right thing to do is. But this other scenario that they come up with is relevantly analogous to the difficult situation that they're really interested in, right? It has the same moral features, the same relevant moral features to the difficult issue that we're really interested in. So then we just focus on the easy one, come to some conclusion about what the right thing to do is for that easy situation, and then apply that same moral reasoning to the difficult situation. And so that can help us to sort of sweep away all of the irrelevant details or emotional attachments or anything and figure out exactly what is the right decision in the more difficult situation. So here's a specific example of that. And this is one of the most famous examples of an argument by analogy in the applied ethics literature. It comes from Peter Singer, one of his early most famous essays by him, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. So I'm going to hold off on, maybe by the title you can get a sense of what he's aiming at here, but here's the analogy that he comes up with. So here's the scenario that he considers, and he's going to then try to show that this scenario is analogous to the one that he's really interested in. So suppose you're walking by a pond, and it's a relatively shallow pond, so it's no deeper than just say like waist deep or mid-chest height or something. So if you were out in this pond, you're not really in danger of drowning at all. So there's no real physical danger to you. But as you walk by, you notice that there's a small child flailing about in the pond, and they're too small, right? They can't reach the bottom, so they're going to drown in this pond. And so you know, since you know it's a shallow pond, that you can walk out there and you can save the child's life. But the pond, in all likelihood, is very kind of mucky, muddy, nasty bottom to it. And you don't have time to take off your shoes. And so you know that once you do this, it's probably going to ruin your shoes. And in fact, let's go ahead and say it's definitely going to ruin your shoes. And let's say that these are pretty nice shoes. You know, let's say they're $200 shoes. So what do? Right? Do you wade in and save the child, but thereby ruin your shoes? Or do you just stand on the side and say, well, you know, I don't want to ruin my shoes, so I'm going to go ahead and let the child drown? Well, hopefully the answer is relatively easy here. You save the child, right? Like the child's life is more valuable than your shoes. And so you wade in. It's like, yeah, you're going to have to spend money to get new shoes apparently, or just deal with having like ruined shoes. But you got to save this kid's life. And so that's the easy scenario. Now, once we've come to a conclusion about that, by saying like the child's life is more valuable than my $200 shoes, then comes the real conclusion, which is that Peter Singer says that that scenario, the shallow pond scenario, is analogous to donating to reliable charities that are saving the lives of starving children around the world, right? So should you donate, let's say about $200 to UNICEF or Oxfam or one of these other really high quality charities that really are saving children's lives around the world, children who otherwise would starve to death, or they're lacking some basic medical supplies or something along those lines. Saving one of those children's lives is more important than whatever you would be spending that $200 on. So the argument goes, certainly if you're going to spend that $200 on something relatively trivial or some little luxury, you know, it's your money that you're reserving for, going to concerts or going to movies or just buying some extra treat for yourself one way or another. What's more important, you know, having money for going to the movies or saving some child's life, right? And when it comes to donating to charity, people have sort of preconceived ideas. They already have perhaps settled beliefs about that. It might engage their emotions. It can be a very complicated issue. And so that's why Singer used this relatively simple scenario of the shallow pond and argued that shallow pond scenario is relevantly analogous to the donating to charities scenario. Now you already can maybe start thinking of some ways in which these are disanalogous, right? There might be some differences between the shallow pond situation and the donating to charity situation. And I encourage you to take an introductory ethics class in which you almost certainly would address this issue. You know, it's really common for this argument to be presented in those classes. And you can talk about that, right? You can get up some debate as to whether this is a good analogy and whether we should accept Singer's conclusion or not. Okay, so next argument form. And this one is actually kind of similar to the statistical syllogism that we already saw. The statistical syllogism said that a certain percentage of A's are B, and then it talks about a particular A and says that, so there's, it's a certain chance then that A has that same property B. Well, this is similar, except instead of talking about what the percentage of A's overall have a certain property B, instead it's taking a sample from that overall complete group of A's, taking a sample of the A's, and then looking at what percentage of the sample has this property B. And then assuming that the percentage of A's in our sample that have that property is reflective of the overall, like the whole group of A's that have a similar percentage of them have that property B. And so this is extremely common in science. In fact, almost all scientific research proceeds this way. Right? So if you were a biologist that was studying a specific species, you wouldn't want to have to measure every single individual member of that species. That might actually be kind of impossible. And so you take a sample. It could be a relatively small sample of the total population of that species, study that small sample, figure out what they're like, and then infer that what you figured out about that sample is also true about the whole population. So that's kind of the standard pattern for an argument, that's induction by enumeration, as they call it in the book. So what are some of the things that we need to keep track of when we see these kinds of arguments, or if we're going to try to do this kind of a study where we're taking a sample and studying a sample and then inferring that the sample is giving us information about the whole population? So here are some of the things that you need to keep track of when you're doing this inference from a sample to the whole, right? Something that's true about a sample, and then inferring that that must also be true about the whole group or the whole population. Selecting the sample is important. Like how is the sample selected? How big does the sample need to be? What's an appropriate size? And then, especially in situations where we're dealing with polling results from a human population, from a sample of a human population, we're asking them questions to get their viewpoints on things, then C can become very relevant here, right? There's some important psychological factors to consider. So let's go through each of these in turn. So selecting the sample. What we want is a representative sample of the population. Right? So if you're trying to, for example, you're testing some new medication to see if it's effective against some particular disease, and of course you want the medication to be effective for the whole human population, you wouldn't just, in your sample, you wouldn't just try to have like only males, right? Only men, only men over 50, between 50 and 60 years of age, and then see how it works for that relatively restricted sample, and then infer that the same thing must happen for everybody. Right? That's not what you want, because your sample is not representative of the whole population. You need all the different ages and different genders and so on. You need a good mix in your sample, a mix in your sample that's similar to the mix in the whole population. One way that can be reliable for doing that is just have a random sample. Right? So this is when every member of the population has an equal chance of being a member of the sample group. But even then, you have to sort of review what sample you ended up with, because you could still get some like quirky accidental results. So you might still have to manage that group a little bit, right? So let's say that you're testing this new medication and you end up with a sample group that you're going to test this on, and it's like 100 people, which sounds like a pretty good sample size, perhaps. But it just works out, just accidentally. You didn't try to do it this way. You gave everybody in the whole population an equal chance of being a member of the sample group, but it just worked out that almost everybody in your sample group is male. Well, if you see that happened, well, you're gonna have to try again, right? You're gonna have to like adjust things so that it more accurately reflects the whole population. So random is good, but not perfect. Then the size of the sample, how big does the sample need to be? Well, yeah, as they talk about in the book, there is no simple formula for this. There's no standard number. But what we can say is that as the size of the population, the whole group, the whole population gets bigger and bigger, the sample that you draw from that whole group needs to be a smaller and smaller percentage of the total. That's assuming that as you increase the population size, you're not also increasing just like all sorts of different crazy diversity and more different types of things included in that population. So all else being equal, as the population size goes up, the percentage of the population that should be included in the sample to make it a good sample goes down. So that might sound a little confusing. So let's look at hopefully a pretty simple example. So let's say we're talking about a population of marbles. And the marble population has this feature that 75% of them are red and 25% of them are blue. And you don't want to go through looking at every single individual marble in the population. You want to get a representative sample to give you a sense of what the percentages are. And you want your percentages, to come out as close to reality as possible. So let's say that the total number of marbles in your population is 20. So how many marbles do you need in your sample in order to get a good sense of what the ratio of red marbles to blue marbles is in the population of 20. Well, you know, this is such a small population that maybe you could go ahead and just look at the color of all 20 marbles. But if you wanted to instead go through this process of selecting a sample, how many would you need? 10 would probably be good. You know, if you only took 2 or 3, then there's a chance that all 3 of them are going to be red. In fact, a pretty good chance that all 3 of them are going to be red. And then you would say, oh, all these marbles are red, so it must be that all the marbles in the whole population are red. And you would have missed that 25% of them are blue. Or it could be really weird, and the 3 that you picked just happen to be 3 blue marbles. Or maybe 2 of them are blue and 1 of them is red. It's like when you're only picking 3 out of 20, there's a pretty good chance that that could happen. And that would, again, completely throw off your estimate of what the whole population of 20 is really like. So 10 would probably be pretty good if your population is 20. That you'd probably get around 3/4 of those 10 being red and 1/4 of them being blue. But now let's say that the total number of marbles in your population is 1,000. Clearly you need more than 10 because this again could sort of throw things off. If 75% of them are red and you only pick 10 out of 1,000, there's a decent chance that all 10 you pick are going to be red. Or, you know, it's also possible that, you know, 10 or 8 or 9 of them are blue. And again, that would pretty radically throw off your estimate of what the whole population is like. So maybe 100 seems like that would be plenty, right? If you really are randomly selecting them, every marble in the population of 1,000 has an equal chance of being part of your sample group. Then if you picked 100 of them, it seems pretty likely that you're going to get the appropriate ratio of red and blue. It might not be perfectly 75% of them are red and perfectly 25% of them are blue. It might be off by a little bit, but you're going to get a pretty accurate sample. Now let's say that the total population of marbles goes up to 10,000. Do you need to pick way more marbles? No. It turns out that if you really do randomly select 100 marbles, again, you're probably, in all likelihood, going to get about 3/4 of those marbles, those 100 marbles being red, and about 1/4 of them being blue. And so that will give you a pretty good representation of what the whole population of 10,000 is like, right? So just because the population goes up really big, that doesn't mean your sample size has to get gigantic. So you might see, like in polling, like political polling, so they say like, oh, this candidate for office, are you for or against that candidate? And so let's say it's the presidential candidate. So we've got the whole country voting, all eligible voters in the country, of which there's, what, about 150 million, let's say, getting up close to 200 million possible voters in the election. How many people do you need to ask in order to get a good representative sample of that population of 200 million? Well, you might see in some of these polls, they only ask maybe about 1,200, 1,500 people, and that might seem like just sort of a ridiculously small sample size for the whole population. Well, that's actually not the case. It's actually a pretty good sample size because you're just asking a simple yes or no question. And so there's not a lot of diversity of possible answers. There's only 2 possible answers. And so if you're asking 1,500 people, as long as you really did sort of get a good representative sample, you know, you randomly asked everybody in the population this one question, then 1,500 people will give you a pretty good sense of what the population overall thinks about this political candidate. Okay, so now that we're thinking about asking people a question like this, that brings us to this third one, the psychological factors for human polling data can be very influential, right? So the phrasing of a question can be very important. And so here's an example that I brought up in a previous presentation. It went something like this, where let's say that we're asking people about their opinion on tax policy, like the current government tax policy. And they ask the question, so are you for or against the government's current job-killing tax policy? Like, okay, so you just phrased it in a strange way, right? By throwing in job-killing in there, that's going to skew the results, right? So if you just simply ask, what's your opinion on the government's tax policy? Let's say you might get like 50% of people are in favor and 50% are opposed. Let's just say that that's what you would get. But if you phrase it differently and you say, are you in favor of the government's job-killing tax policy? Well, you're going to get way more people opposed because it sounds bad, right? And so if they hadn't thought about it too much yet, as soon as you throw in a job-killing, then that's automatically going to make their opinion switch to being against the policy. And so you're not perhaps getting a very good, accurate representation of what the population overall actually thinks. Then social cues on the part of the questioner. So let's say this is a face-to-face poll, and so I'm face-to-face asking you these questions. And I use the neutral phrasing, what's your opinion on the tax policy? But I say it like this, what's your opinion on the tax policy? Or what's your opinion on the tax policy? Then it's not that subtle the way I did it, but just the emotional content of my delivery can maybe skew what the people's responses are like, because I'm setting them up to feel a certain emotion regarding the tax policy. It also can matter a great deal whether the polling is anonymous or not, especially for relatively controversial or maybe embarrassing questions. So let's say that you wanted to get a sense of the rate of use of illegal drugs among a population of high school students. And the people you were asking, they knew that their name was going to be attached to the answer that they give, and everybody would see what they answered. How many of those students are going to say that they have in fact used illegal drugs? Right? Maybe some of them, but most of them, even if they have tried illegal drugs, they're going to say no, because they don't want people to know. They don't want people to become aware that they have used these drugs, especially the authorities or their parents or whatnot. And so this could dramatically skew the results. So you got to keep that kind of a thing anonymous, so that even if they know that it's anonymous, if it's something controversial like that, they maybe will still say no, even when in fact they have used illegal drugs. But it's at least more likely that they'll admit to this controversial thing that they've done, if they know that nobody's going to be aware of what their answer actually was. Okay, so there's just so many things to talk about with these inductive arguments and inductive argument forms, and what makes them stronger, what makes them weaker. This at least gives us a bit of a start in thinking about these kinds of arguments. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there.